2025. On behalf of the WashU Alumni Association, I am honored to welcome alumni, parents, students, and friends to this virtual event, diving into the Living Earth Collaborative with international lizard expert, Jonathan Losos. Throughout the presentation, we will have some time for questions. Thank you to those who submitted some in the event registration. We've received many, and I've done my best to combine the questions we received into themes. I will try to get to as many as possible. I also encourage you to all participate today by submitting questions through the Q&A function. Again, we will do our best to answer as many as possible. This event is being recorded and will be posted on the Alumni Association YouTube channel later this week. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Losos. Born and raised in St. Louis and a blues and cards fan, Dr. Losos is an internationally renowned scholar in the field of evolutionary biology. He is known for his research on how lizards can rapidly evolve and adapt to changing environments. He has written 2 books, including his most recent, Improbable Destinies, Fate, Chance, and the Future of Evolution. And if you enjoy the next 55 minutes, you will really like this book. Dr. Losos has also written a biology textbook used by colleges across the country and is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. But perhaps more importantly, he was my professor. When the folks at the Alumni Association asked if I introduced him, I jumped at the chance. I had Professor Losos for Biology 3501 Evolution in 1990, well, we'll just say it was a while ago. Every Monday, Wednesday, Friday in Rebstock 322, Dr. Losos led a dynamic and fascinating class that exposed his students to the intricacies of microevolution within populations and the wonder of species diversification across ecosystems. He challenged us to consider the various evolutionary processes that led to the diverse life on Earth and forced us to question any misconceptions we clung to. His class made a big impact on me. I even kept my notebook from the class, which is a whole nother issue that I won't get into right now, except to say to my husband, who is also on this call, see, I told you I was going to need that someday. I also found my term paper, B-. And actually, let's all decide and agree to keep that on the down low, because my dad might also be on this call and he thinks I got straight A's in college. So Dr. Losos's feedback was constructive without being punitive. He made me want to do better. His notes fostered a growth mindset, and that's even before we knew about growth mindsets. Every class, Dr. Losos shared his love for the natural world. I learned that you can never learn too much about lizards. Indeed, his work continues to inspire me in my current profession as a high school biology teacher. Dr. Losos continues to engage with the next generation of scientists as he teaches undergrads at WashU, and he has zoomed into my own classes in Massachusetts for the past 2 years. Dr. Losos earned his BA from Harvard, followed by his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. After beginning his academic career at WashU, Professor Losos then went back to Harvard, where he was a professor of biology and curator of herpetology at the university's Museum of Comparative Zoology. Now he's back in St. Louis, where he holds the inaugural William H. Danforth Distinguished University Professorship and serves as director as the Living Earth Collaborative, an academic center dedicated to advancing the study of biodiversity. Their research addresses the most pressing issue facing humankind today, the ability to sustain life on Earth. It's been an honor to introduce him. Please welcome Professor Jonathan Losos.
Well, thank you very much, Beanie, for those very kind words. And as for that term paper, that was the very first time I taught any college course, and I'm sure that it was a mistake. So if you please submit it for a regrade, we can get that taken care of. As for the rest of you, thanks so much for showing up this evening. I'm really delighted to get the opportunity to talk to you about my own research and about WashU's new Living Earth Collaborative. So why don't we get going? Let's see if I can share the screen appropriately. Okay, and hopefully you can all see the screen now. So in his final commencement address, Chancellor Emeritus Mark Wrighton 2 years ago said that there are three major problems facing humanity today. The first two are climate change and racial inequity. The third problem he pointed out is the ongoing global biodiversity extinction crisis, the destruction of the world's natural heritage. Chancellor Wrighton was absolutely correct in highlighting this problem. Recent estimates suggest that as many as 1 million species may be headed for extinction in the near future. And routinely, every few weeks, there's a new report of new species determined to be extinct. So it really is a major problem. And for that reason, Washington University created the Living Earth Collaborative 4 years ago. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on in our session today. But today I want to talk about first the general question of biodiversity and what it actually is and how scientists study it. Now, if you look up online the definition of biodiversity, you will find very long, complicated definitions. But really, the essence of the term is very simple. Biodiversity is the variation among living organisms in the world around us. And this variation takes many different forms. For example, there's the variation that occurs within species, as in our own species, or the variation in a species of snail. So there's lots of variation within species. There's also variation among closely related species. This, for example, is a group of birds that evolved on Hawaii. And so this is variation among species. And finally, there's the variation that occurs among the species in an ecosystem that live together. So just as there are many different aspects of biodiversity, there are equally as many different ways to study biodiversity. And so scientists go about this task in many different ways. And so I'd like to illustrate some of the ways in which biodiversity is studied using my own research on, as Beanie said, on lizards, particularly on lizards in the genus Enolis. This is a group of lizards found in the southeastern United States. Many of you may be familiar with them, or found throughout the Caribbean and the tropical and subtropical parts of Central and South America. Now, the reason scientists are interested in this group is that there are 400 species of these lizards. And so it's obviously a group that has been very successful evolutionarily. And so we can investigate why this group has done so well and how particular species have adapted to the particular part of the world in which they live. So this is a typical Enolis lizard from the Dominican Republic. Animals, as they're called, are characterized by these large, extensible throat fans, a flap of skin under their neck. Almost all species, the males have dewlaps, and in many of the species, females have them. And we'll come back to the dewlaps in a minute. So the first question you might ask is, what is the evolutionary history of this group? How did they evolve? Well, the standard way, the traditional way of studying evolution is to look at fossils. However, small lizards that live in wet, moist areas, as these lizards do, don't fossilize very well. The reason is that they die, they fall to the ground, and they quickly rot, too quickly to be covered up by soil and turned into rock. And so for that reason, we have almost no fossils of animals, with one exception, and that is these little lizards entombed in amber. Now, amber, as you might know, is a sticky sap exuded by a tree that hardens and becomes very hard and becomes fossilized. And anything that is inside that oozy stuff ends up being preserved. And so presumably that's what happened to these little lizards. They ran across the sap, they got stuck, they got covered up by more sap, and eventually they became fossils. Well, a few years ago, I should point out, these fossils are from the Dominican Republic. They're actually, for those of you who have seen Jurassic Park, which is probably almost all of you, you may recall that in the movie, they got their DNA from mosquitoes in amber in the Dominican Republic. It turns out those amber mines do exist, but they're not 100 million years old. They're not from the Jurassic, they're 20 million years old. So really the movie should have been called Miocene Park, but that's a side point. So a few years ago, I decided to study the Enolis lizards stuck in amber because they're really the only fossils we have. And I found out that there are 39 specimens known to exist, either in natural history museums or in the hands of private collectors. We were able to get hold of 38 of them. With these specimens, when we got them, we took them to several different natural history museums in London or in Boston, and we took CAT scans of them, just like the CAT scans that you get at a hospital, only tuned for little things. And these CAT scans were spectacular, showing us the fine details of the anatomy. This specimen here is at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. You can see first that it was dropped, broken in half, and glued back together, and they didn't quite get it right. But more importantly, we can see every bone in the skeleton beautifully. We can measure it, examine it, and compare to modern day lizards. Here's another specimen. There's nothing in the middle. Apparently, all the microbes in the gut rotted away the middle before it got covered by the sap. But we can see the skull very clearly and some of the other bones. Here's another skeleton. We couldn't really see it at all. We could see it's a lizard. We could see the legs and tail. But again, the CAT scan showed us all. Well, it was one of the most exciting projects I've ever done because we never knew what we'd find in each specimen. But we were able to get a good look at the skeletons of these 20 million-year-old lizards and compare them to the ones living today. And to our surprise, we found there were almost no differences. It's as if the lizards had evolved, and by 20 million years ago, they had reached their perfect adapted form and really haven't changed much since then. So that's one way to study evolution, by looking at whatever fossils are available. Another way in recent years is to look at the DNA, to compare the DNA of different species, or these days, to look at the entire genomes, which is now readily possible. We did, in fact, the first reptile to have its genome sequenced was one of our lizards, the green anole. Here's the paper we published in Nature about it. So what we're able now to do is to study to sequence the DNA of all these species and compare their genomes. And what we can infer is that the species that are more similar genetically have only diverged from a common ancestor relatively recently, whereas species that are very different in their genes probably diverged a long time ago. And so in that way, we can make inferences about how evolution occurs by looking at the DNA of modern day species. Now, another very important way we study biodiversity is simply going out into nature and observing species and collecting data on where they live and what they do, what I call basic discovery science. And that is still critically important because for many species, even today, we don't know much about them. I want to give you one example from my own work. It's of this great lizard here. It's a species of Enolis lizard from the mountains of Ecuador. It's quite unusual because it has this long horn. Well, this species was first discovered in 1954, and then a few other specimens were found. And then by the 1960s, people stopped finding them. And for 35 years, no one saw one. We thought they were extinct until about 2005 when they were rediscovered. And in fact, a colleague of mine went down to the mountains in Ecuador, and he was able to find where they live. And he found that by going out at night with very strong flashlights, it turns out they're easier to find at night. And here one is sleeping on a branch about 30 feet up in the rainforest canopy, the cloud forest canopy. Well, it was great to know that the species was still around, but all we knew was where they slept because they spent all their time looking for them at night. And so once we knew they were there, I led a team to go back down there to try to observe them during the day to get any sort of information. We knew anything about how they live, what they do, and more importantly, what is this horn all about? We really had no idea. Now, one thing we did know is that the horn is possessed by the males, but not by the females. So presumably it has something to do with reproduction. I envision males having horn fights, if you will, for dominance and so on. Well, we went down there and we found them and we discovered a lot about them. The first thing we found is, why are they so hard to study? And the reason is they're incredibly well camouflaged. They're really hard to see against a background, particularly the yellow bamboo where they live. Also, it turns out they walk like this, very slowly and kind of like a leaf swaying in the breeze. And so unless you're looking right at it, you won't pick it up. You'll just think it's swaying vegetation. We also learned something about the horns. Look at this lizard here. This is one of the ones we caught. Watch its horn. Did you see that? Let me show you again. Watch the horn when it hits the leaf. It bends right over. The horn has no stiffness whatsoever. So they're clearly not fighting with each other because the horn would bend right over. So that took care of that hypothesis. But we did learn something else. Look at this lizard here. Look at this poor sad sack lizard, this male lizard with a droopy horn. No female is going to go for him, right? Well, we caught some of these lizards and we wanted to see how they fed, how they ate. So we fed this lizard. Here's a lizard. Here's a grasshopper climbing up towards it. The horn right now is horizontal, but look what happens as it goes to eat it. it lifts its horn up. Now it's 45 degrees. That astonished my friends who study anatomy, because lizards are not supposed to have muscles on the tip of their noses. How did they do that? We still don't know. Well, our colleagues from Ecuador who joined us there captured some specimens, took them back to Quito and studied them in the lab, and they found that they actually have ritualized behaviors where the male will swing his horn in front of both a submissive male or in front of a female in courtship. And so that's what the horn is used in displays. And why that evolved, we don't know, but that's what they're doing with them. Anyway, this was just one example of going out and getting the basic aspects of the biology of species that was not previously known. Now, any talk on evolution has to mention Charles Darwin. And I want to tell you something that you may not be aware of, and that is Darwin was a great experimentalist. Even before experiments had become the gold standard in modern science, Darwin was doing experiments, way ahead of his time in this way as well as others. For example, he was wondering, how do seeds survive and get to islands? Can they survive in salt water? So he did some experiments. In fact, you can try at your home some of the great experiments Darwin did. So Darwin was well ahead of his time in doing experiments. And I want to take that thought and talk about these dewlaps that the lizards have. Here is just the variety of different colors and patterns that different species have. But what do these mean? What is the lizard saying when it sticks out its dewlap? And what does it matter if it has little white dots or a yellow circle? Well, a postdoc working in my lab decided to find out by doing an experiment. She designed a lizard robot that moved like an anole to see how live lizards would respond. And if that worked, she could then manipulate the dewlap, make it bigger or smaller, change colors, and find out what aspects of the dewlap the lizard responds to. Well, will real lizards respond to a dewlap? Decide for yourself. Absolutely, he attacks the robot just like he would a real lizard. So the robots have worked brilliantly in letting us do these experiments. I would like to think that Darwin would have approved of this approach to understanding the function and the significance of the dewlap. Darwin, however, did not use experiments to test his greatest theory, the theory of evolution by natural selection. And the reason he didn't do that, it didn't even occur to him, is that he thought that evolution proceeded glacially slowly, that it would take eons for any change to be observable. You couldn't observe it during a lifetime, much less a couple-year experiment. So he never proposed such research. However, we now know in this one way, Darwin was mistaken. Actually, evolution can proceed very rapidly when natural selection was strong, as occurs when environments change. And what that means is we can actually test evolutionary hypotheses in nature and hope to get a result in real time. And so we've tried to do this in a number of ways with the lizards we study. One pattern that's very common among these lizards is that species that use broad surfaces have long legs that let them run very quickly, whereas species on narrow surfaces have very short legs that let them move with agility and they don't fall off. And in fact, this has evolved many different times in these lizards. And so this association suggests a causal relationship. But as you know, correlation does not prove causation. And what would be better than actually to do an experiment to see if there is a relationship between the size of the surface they use and their leg length. And so we designed just that experiment in the Bahamas. We took a species that lives on big trees here on this island in the background and moved them to tiny little islands that don't have big trees, that only have narrow little bushes for them to sit on. And our hypothesis was very clear. If the surfaces they're using determine their leg length, they should evolve shorter legs. And this is what happened. Over the course of 3 years, sure enough, all 7 populations evolved shorter legs, exactly as predicted. So I have to say that these experiments, I'm sure Darwin would have approved. And I think they're one of the most exciting developments in biology these days, the ability to actually test ideas experimentally on evolution in natural systems. And so we have many other experiments ongoing even as we speak. So these are a few of the ways in which scientists study biodiversity. There are many others, but these are the ones we use studying lizards. And so that's all I have to say in this part of the presentation. I'll speak a little later about the Living Earth Collaborative.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. We had some questions that came up through the registration that I really want to get to, because this theme kind of came up a lot. We had a lot of people curious about just what is some advice you would give to people who are considering a career in research, in the research fields. Is there anything you wish you had known or done, when you were in high school or college, that could have impacted your career path?
Well, that's a great question. And for someone in high school, the best advice is there's two pieces of advice, really. And one is do well in your classes, really learn a lot, particularly take science classes as much as you can, biology, if you're interested in this sort of science. Surprisingly, though, other skills are necessary, math in particular. I remember when I started college, I was shocked that math was very important to my biology classes. But it turns out a lot of the things you learn, the theories, the underlying explanations require facility with math. And these days with computers, that good scientists must be very adept with computers. So take your science classes and also get math and statistics if you want, and computers. In addition, if you get the opportunity to get any hands-on experience doing something in nature with a zoo, with an environmental group, just being an assistant, if you have those opportunities, that's a great way to find out whether you actually like doing research as well. And you don't need to do that in high school. We very much emphasize in college. Part of our biology major, like many, strongly encourages students to do research because it lets you know whether it's something you like, and it also lets you know where knowledge comes from. It's one thing to read it in a textbook or hear it in a lecture, and another to actually, with your own hands, understand the process by which knowledge is gained.
Speaking about research, can you just talk a little bit about what it was like? The picture of you on that little island. I kind of fantasize about doing some research in the Caribbean, but can you talk a little bit about just the research in general? Did you experience any pitfalls or twists and turns?
Well, I would say in general, when you're doing field work, your motto should be expect the unexpected. Things always go wrong in all sorts of different ways. And so you have to plan as much as you can so that you can foresee problems, but then you just have to be flexible and roll with the punches. And I'm just thinking to some of the fails we've had over the years or the issues that have come up. I mean, one common one is the organisms don't cooperate. For example, the project I told you about with the horned anole, when we went to find them in Ecuador, my colleague had found them by finding them at night, and he told us exactly where to go. And so we went to that place, we had our flashlights, and we found them. There they are. But we wanted to see what they were doing during the day. So we said, yep, they're here. We'll come back tomorrow and we'll find them with our binoculars and so on. We came back the next day. We couldn't find a single one. I mean, we'd found tons of them sleeping at night. We couldn't find them. We did it again the next night somewhere else, the same outcome the following day. We couldn't find them. It turns out they are so camouflaged that even though they were all over the place, they were hard to find. And what we had to do, actually, fortunately, in this case, the solution was simple. We just went out at night. We found where they were. We tied a ribbon around the tree, went to sleep for a couple of hours, and got back before dawn while they were still sleeping, and basically watched them as they woke up and followed them that way. In other cases, sometimes you just can't find them. It can be a real bummer. There have been times. There was a time years ago we were in Cuba at the famous Bay of Pigs, the Bahia de Cochinos in Cuba, looking for lizards. We were out at night looking for them. That's a time-honored tradition. And I guess the people there, gringos don't come around there very much. And we were confronted by two guys with these old rifles. They were really muskets. And I'm told that my Spanish got better really quickly as I tried to explain what we were doing. It turned out to be perfectly fine. But, we've had guns pulled on us several times, never in a particularly threatening way. And then, of course, the worst thing in the Bahamas is we've had hurricanes that have gone over our site, caused immense damage to the study, although letting us study the effect of hurricanes. But the first time this happened, we were actually on the site when the hurricane hit, and that was quite an experience. So all kinds of stuff happens. Equipment breaks, airplanes lose your equipment. Once we were in a study and it rained for 2 weeks and it was so humid, our computer stopped working. Or actually the R key stopped working, but a critical program you had to type run to get it to go. So just stuff happens, and you just got to be ready for it and roll with the punches.
Yeah. One last question before we go on to the Living Earth Collaborative. Kind of selfishly, I want to hear what you have to say about this, because my students often say to me that that evolution is just a theory. So how would you respond?
Well, that's, the word theory is used differently in science and in just general conversation. To people in general, theory is just an idea, a hunch, just something that might be. But scientists, when they're speaking carefully, refer theory to an idea that is so well established that really no single observation can disprove it, because there's such a body of evidence supporting it. So for example, gravity is a theory. And that's because all these different observations and different equations and everything support its existence. Really, the same is true of evolution. There is so much evidence from so many different fields of study that support the idea that life has evolved over time, that it is hard to imagine any one observation that say, oh, that was all wrong, we were mistaken, because it's such a body of evidence. The term that scientists use that people get confused with, we use the term hypothesis for something that's much less established. It is an idea that we want to test, but it may very well be wrong. But theories are very well established. It's not to say the theory couldn't be disproven, but it would take a lot of evidence to counter all of the evidence that we have in its favor.
Great. All right, well, thank you. Those aren't the only questions. I saw a few that came up on the Q&A too. So let's get to the Living Collaborative part, and we'll reconvene after that. All
right, part 2. Let's see if I can get the screen back up. And there we go. Can you see that, everyone? Tell me if you can't see it. It should be up there. The Living Earth Collaborative. So it was established 4 years ago. It is a partnership between these 3 institutions. And it's a Center for the Study and Conservation of Biodiversity. Now, why did Washington University create this? Well, it turns out that all 3 institutions are global leaders. For example, Washington University, a number of years ago, the National Research Council, an arm of the National Academy of Sciences, ranked programs in ecology and evolution across universities. WashU ranked #1. We were tied with Princeton. So we have a long history of excellence in this area. Similarly, many of you, no doubt, are familiar with the Missouri Botanical Garden and its spectacular gardens, a wonderful place to visit. But what many people don't know is that behind the scenes, the Missouri Botanical Garden is a botanical powerhouse. They have 45 PhD researchers on staff. They work all over the world. Every year, they describe 200, 250 species new to science. They have an herbarium, that's a plant museum with 7 million plant specimens, the largest in the world. So it is one of the great centers for botanical knowledge and discovery in the world today. And it is generally considered one of the 3 great botanical gardens, along with New York Botanical Garden and the Kew Gardens in London. Similarly, the St. Louis Zoo, many of you have visited. It's a fabulous place. It keeps on getting better, spectacular exhibits. They breed endangered species and so on. But again, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that doesn't get as much recognition. In this case, the zoo has something called the Wild Care Institute, which is a center focused on the conservation of species around the world. And they have 17 different focal areas that range from research locally in Forest Park or elsewhere in Missouri to centers in Ecuador, in the Galapagos, in the Sahara Desert, in Asia, and in many other places. And so they have a fabulous program on conserving endangered species. And so our goal was to bring these 3 great institutions together to, in some sense, make the whole greater than the sum of their parts. Because as often happens, although we're all in the same city, there wasn't that much interaction between the 3. Now, I want to emphasize what the WashU brings to this partnership. Of course, we have great biologists and great scientists in the anthropology department who study apes and monkeys and humans and so on. But in addition, we have expertise in many other areas that affect how biodiversity interrelates with humans, from fields of philosophy, political science. The business school has a program in Madagascar. The medical school with a lot of research, such as virus evolution, very important today. The engineering school, surprisingly enough. Social work, a number of people working on sustainable development, South America and Africa, and how people's lives can be made better while at the same time bettering the environment. Landscape architecture, envisioning the city of the future with nature an integral part. And of course, our Tyson Research Center, a field station on the edge of town. So that there's a lot going on in different aspects at Washington University with the opportunity to get these departments and people working with the zoo and the garden. And so that was the reason to create the Living Earth Collaborative. And there was a second reason, and that is, consider the fact that these three institutions are all in St. Louis. Now, we can quibble on what constitutes greatness, but I would argue that there are very few places in the world, almost none, where you can find a great university, a great zoo, and a great botanical garden. In fact, really the only other one I can think of is in New York. And in New York, those institutions are separated by an hour by subway, whereas here in St. Louis, they are 10 minutes away. And so one of the reasons to establish the Living Earth Collaborative was that biodiversity is an academically important area, it's a societally important area, and Washington University could do something that our peer institutions, the Vanderbilts, the Dukes, the Northwesterns, even the Yales and Stanfords, they couldn't do that. So this is something that WashU could do that's important and that would stand out and bring WashU distinction. And that was the reason behind the creation of the Living Earth Collaborative. Now, what do we actually do? Well, of course, we foster research. The idea is to get these researchers together at the three institutions and to create new synergies, new collaborations that otherwise haven't existed. And similarly, to work towards the conservation of endangered species, endangered ecosystems. And of course, education. What a great opportunity for our students to take advantage of these world-class institutions just a stone's throw away. So we're working on having more classes work at the garden at the zoo. This, for example, is a freshman class. First semester freshmen spend an afternoon every week at the zoo or at the garden or several other places, getting a lecture. Here they are at the climatron in the garden, seeing the diversity of tropical plants and actually taking samples to collect DNA from them. Here they are at Big Cat Country learning about cat conservation. Here at the Butterfly House, which is part of the Missouri Botanical Garden, learning about insect diversity. So trying to get more classes to take advantage of these institutions. In addition, of course, there are internships, getting students over to these places, getting hands-on experience, doing the various things that go on there, and actually doing actual research, doing honors research projects at the garden, at the zoo, or elsewhere. Huge opportunity for us to create a program on biodiversity that really would stand out and would be a great draw to get the best students to come to WashU. Now, in addition to this, we have what we call flagship initiatives. We've decided to invest in a few major projects that made sense to focus on given the complementary or overlapping expertise in the three institutions, something big problems that we could tackle by working together. And these problems could pertain to a particular part of the world, they could pertain to a particular type of organism or a particular topic. In thinking about what such flagship initiatives might be, the first one, the obvious first choice, was working on the biodiversity of Madagascar. Now, part of the reason for that is that Madagascar is the one place that the zoo and the garden were already working together. In addition, Washington University has a long history of having researchers working there. So it seemed a logical place since we already have such great expertise. Now, you probably know something about Madagascar from the Madagascar films you may have seen with your children. You probably will not be surprised to know that these movies are almost entirely inaccurate. But there is a kernel of truth in them, that these species actually are recognizable as different species of lemurs. And in fact, lemurs are found nowhere else in the world. In fact, this is true of much of the biodiversity in Madagascar. 95% of the species are found nowhere else. So sometimes it's called the eighth continent. It is so unique in terms of its species composition. Sadly, Madagascar is a very poor country with lots of problems. A lot of the biodiversity is in great jeopardy or has already been lost. And so we've started a new project researching on lemurs and their role in the forest, both to learn basic science about them, but then to try to figure out what we can do to help conserve them. The second project that has just gotten off the ground focuses on wild canids. Now, canids are foxes, wolves, and their relatives. And we're taking advantage of the fact that the Endangered Wolf Center is located here in St. Louis. The Wolf Center is one of the world's great institutions for breeding endangered species and reintroducing them into the wild. And so combining their expertise with the people at the zoo and several of the faculty at WashU, we are starting a new project on canid conservation. The last major initiative is looking at urban biodiversity, at the species that occur in cities around us. How do species adapt? How do urban ecosystems function? And how can we build cities so that nature is an integral part. This is a topic of huge interest in many parts of WashU, as well as the garden and the zoo and the community at large. And in fact, figuring out exactly what it is we want to do has been difficult because there's such great interest in so many different ways. The launch of this initiative was delayed by COVID, but we're going to get back to it shortly. And I hope that we can start something in this area very shortly. Now, in addition to these big projects, we offer what are called seed grants, and they're just what they sound like. We offer a little bit of money to researchers to start new collaborations. And these collaborations have been incredibly diverse. For example, several have focused on the biodiversity in the very rich area of the Andes Mountains in South America, in Peru and Ecuador, focusing on frogs and trees and birds. Closer to home, there's a study looking at fish that live in streams in the city of St. Louis. And the question is, how can they survive in streams that are polluted by salt runoff and other chemicals? The streams often are very hot because the trees have been cut down that otherwise would shade them. How do they survive? Well, the researchers, are looking at the genomes of these fish to look for evidence, genetic evidence of how they've adapted. Or another study, one of my favorites, working on caves in rainforests in Costa Rica. These caves have been inhabited by bats for thousands of years. And so there are immense deposits of guano, feet thick. And so researchers from the anthropology department and earth and planetary science, along with the botanical garden, are drilling cores of guano and then chemically analyzing it. And from that chemical signature, they can infer how much rainfall and what temperature there was going back thousands of years. We actually don't have a good record of how the rainforest has changed in terms of its climate. This may answer that question and may be very useful in understanding how the rainforest will change in the years to come. Here's just a list of some of our other projects. We've now funded 28 of them over 4 years, a great diversity. I'd be happy to talk about them more later. Here's the ones from 2 years ago, and I like pointing it out to point out which parts of WashU are involved in these projects. We have people, scientists, from all corners of the university getting involved in these projects. And that's, to me, very satisfying to see that the Living Earth Collaborative really is extending across the university. So I'll just say I've been challenged recently to envision what the Living Earth Collaborative 2.0 would look like as part of the university's strategic planning exercise. And basically, I think there are opportunities to even further address important societal issues that, and particularly those that intersect with other WashU initiatives. For example, there's certainly going to be an expansion of WashU's public health programs, but it is increasingly realized that the health of the environment and the health of people are inextricably linked. And so there's ideas called One Health or planetary health, that public health planning must look after the environment as well. And so a biodiversity component of this public health initiative would be very important. Similarly, biodiversity is impacted by and can affect climate change and sustainability, environmental justice, food security, and microbiome science. So it's a very exciting time, and I'm very optimistic that the Living Earth Collaborative can expand to take on some of these broader topics as well. And so with that was a whirlwind tour of the Living Earth Collaborative. But Beanie, I'd be happy to talk about this some more.
Great. Thank you so much. We had a couple of questions, and again, I kind of pulled them together thematically, and also in the Q&A. That kind of talks about this idea of how much we should interfere with biodiversity, in terms of like this great question from Frank Ford, who asked, he grows lilies, and there's a man in Austria who does tissue culture to increase the availability of rare species of lilies, and he sells them. And he thinks worldwide. So you're getting these things over the internet. It kind of reminds me of when over the summer, people were getting these seeds from, Asia sent to them. And, what do we do? What do you think of this practice of taking rare species and taking them out of their ecosystems to grow somewhere else? Is it a good idea?
Well, there's lots of different components to that. On the one hand, taking plants or animals out of where they come from can be a problem in itself. In fact, there are some species that are endangered because collectors go and collect so many of them that the species itself disappears in the wild. So that's certainly one concern right at the right at the outset. Certainly maintaining captive populations can be important, although usually it's zoos and botanical gardens that do this in an organized way as opposed to private individuals. There's also a role for reintroducing those species if they have become very rare. Zoos and gardens have saved some species and put them back. There's also the issue that the world is changing and we can't preserve it as it is because of climate change and many other things. What I'm trying to say is, say you save a species and you want to put it back to where it was, well, that where it was may no longer be suitable because it's gotten too warm. And that can make things tricky to figure out, because the other problem is if you put a species where it doesn't naturally occur, we have a long record of ecological disasters. These are what are called invasive species, where you put something where it doesn't occur naturally and it has a very strong negative effect on the species that live there because those species have not evolved defenses to cope with it. So there's lots of very risky things, lots of ways things can go bad when you do that. However, sometimes it's it's the only way to try to save a species. I guess it's a long way of saying it's a very complicated question, and managing nature today is tricky because of all of these different issues.
Yeah, I think since you brought up climate change, we had a lot of questions about kind of this impact of climate change on biodiversity. Many attendees expressed concerns about climate change affecting specific populations of organisms such as invertebrates and amphibians, the need for broader protections of ecosystems such as wetlands and forests and oceans. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection between biodiversity and climate change and whether or not you've seen evidence of climate change in your specific work with lizards? We had a question in the Q&A about specifically, the health of lizards in particular, I think as it regards to what's happening to our planet.
Well, the climate is changing faster than it has in many millions of years. And so this is a problem because it means a given species, let's just say it occurs in Missouri right now. As it gets warmer, Missouri may become too hot for it, and the habitat to which it's adapted, the temperature may occur up in Iowa or even up in Minnesota. Now, in the old days, before humans were around, there were ice ages, and then there were hot times as well. And populations would migrate north and south, or up mountains and down mountains. But there's two reasons why this is difficult today. One is the climate is changing faster than it did during the ice ages, and so they just can't keep up. And the other problem is now we have highways and cities and agricultural fields blocking species from migrating. And so it's much harder for populations to shift their distribution to stay where they are well adapted. Now, the other possibility is that they will stay where they are and evolve adaptations. And that, as I told you in the first part of my talk, we now know that species can evolve quickly when natural selection is strong. And people are now studying the extent to which populations can adapt to changing climate conditions. And the answer seems to be sometimes they can. Sometimes they'll evolve their way out of trouble. But a lot of times it's too fast. They can't evolve quickly enough. Or making it worse, climate change isn't the only problem, but pollution and habitat destruction, they all add together and the populations just can't handle it all. So climate change is a huge problem for species survival. And it makes it difficult, as I was just saying, because you can't just necessarily, you could have a park, say Yellowstone Park. I'm making up these details. Hey, Yellowstone is a huge area. That's great. But if it becomes too hot for the species that live there, it doesn't matter that it's protected, they may not be able to survive. On the other hand, this gets back to the idea of planetary health that I mentioned a few moments ago. Not only does climate change affect biodiversity, but biodiversity can mitigate or even slow down climate change. I mean, it's simple things like if you keep a lot of rainforest or forests of other type, they will suck up CO2 out of the air and may slow down the rate at which climate change occurs, as opposed to cutting those forests down. Or some of the impacts of climate change, such as hurricanes, if we hadn't cut down all the marshes around New Orleans, a lot of the tidal surge would have been mitigated. And so the point is, it's a two-way arrow. Climate change affects biodiversity, but healthy biodiversity can help forestall climate change as well.
Great, thank you. We also had some questions about just how to get involved. How are current WashU students involved? Are there opportunities to get involved with the Living Earth Collaborative directly? We've got a good group from Missouri on the call. Are there professional or volunteer opportunities available at the center?
So let me start with the students. A lot of what we are trying to do involves students, either the opportunities for classes. We can do a lot more. I mean, lots of classes could be taught partly or entirely using these other institutions, and we could have this fabulous biodiversity undergraduate program. And I think we're heading in that direction. But there are classes that students can take, and I'm hoping for many more. I think one of the things, well, the students also more and more giving them opportunities to get involved in some of the projects. We have a great faculty here in biology and in anthropology working on plants and animals and microbes, but there are also opportunities to work with people at the zoo and the garden and in some of the other local institutions. And so I think that we're going to build a fabulous program for students interested in these sorts of things. One of the things that we're talking about, we really haven't done much yet, is to develop a secondary school initiative to get students, particularly from underprivileged areas, give them the opportunity to get involved with nature and actually see what it's like to work at a zoo or do an internship in some of these things. And that's an area where I think we could give students opportunities that aren't available to them, maybe spark the interest that will lead them to go on to college and end up with a career in that area. As for people more generally in the St. Louis area, we haven't done much yet. We're still developing that. And the zoo and the garden on their own, as well as WashU, have many opportunities. As our projects are developing, there are opportunities to assist in some of them, but that's still kind of nascent. And I have to say, making excuses, COVID did slow us down. We were 2 years old when COVID hit, and we were just about to burst out with lots of things, and that put a halt on many things, which are still halted. But hopefully, once we get past all this, we can expand a lot of the things we're doing.
I was really hoping we'd get through 1 hour without talking about it, but it's impossible. It's all right. It's all right. I knew it was going to happen, but
I have to throw in just a little comment on that. And I mentioned the intersection of public health and biodiversity, and there's no better example of the importance than COVID. That COVID is just the most recent of many diseases that started in animal populations and have spilled over into humans just in the last 20 years. Things like West Nile disease, Hendra virus, SARS, they go on. And some that Ebola. And so understanding what is going on with these viruses in their natural populations and monitoring them, they affect other animals. Apes and gorillas are devastated by Ebola. And so to understand these pandemics and how to prevent them, we need to study the wildlife populations where those viruses occur. And so that's a perfect sort of area where the Living Earth Collaborative, by fostering biodiversity science, can team up with public health initiatives and be a very important part. I think that's going to be a huge growth area.
I hope someone's writing that grant right now.
Well, yes, people are.
Is it already on your desk? Because
we're trying to expand. I'm hoping that will be an area to move. We have these great virologists over at the medical school, but they all study. That's not true. They study. They're not field biologists. That's what's missing from that research. And there's a cool project we funded where one of the things that you might want to do is monitor Ebola, say, in chimps and gorillas. Both because you're concerned about the chimps and gorillas, but you're concerned that they may spill over into humans. And the problem is that chimps and gorillas aren't going to line up and get for blood samples. So how do you get the samples? Well, one way to do it is to go get their fecal samples, go and collect the gorilla poop and sequence it. But that's,
why not? Why wouldn't you?
That's messy work. But another way, we funded some people in the anthropology department, working with people at the medical school and the St. Louis Zoo, to set out insect traps in the Congo rainforest, throughout the Congo, where they capture blood-sucking insects and then look for the virus in the insects, because those insects have been biting the gorillas and the chimps. And in that way, they can monitor the prevalence of Ebola across the entire Congo. And it's like, oh, it's suddenly getting, a big outbreak near Brazzaville or something. And so it's a brilliant approach that could, important for conservation of these animals, but also for us to know what's going on so it doesn't pop up in humans. So stuff like that is it's going to be very important.
It's so creative. It's just so like pulling from all these different places to come up with solutions that impact the biodiversity, but also humans. So that is great. We've time for a couple more. I see that one of the questions came in just about the collaborative, it's between WashU, the zoo, and the botanical garden. What other St. Louis institutions are involved here? And what are the plans to expand the accessibility to the greater community? We have a question from Katerina, who is asking about, she doesn't go to WashU, but can she, get involved somehow? And what are the plans there?
Well, so when the Living Earth Collaborative was created 4 years ago, we were very concerned that this not create a wall between the zoo, the garden, and WashU, and the other great entities in St. Louis. It turns out there's a lot of fabulous biodiversity work being done throughout the St. Louis area. And so we have involved people from many different institutions. University of Missouri St. Louis has a fabulous ecology group. And so they've been involved, people at St. Louis University, even some of the smaller schools in the area had some great scientists. Maryville University, Webster University, St. Louis College of Pharmacy has 2 herpetologists on their staff, which just kind of blows me away. Herpetologists study reptiles and amphibians. And then we have, as well as the colleges and universities, we have the Endangered Wolf Center that I've mentioned. The St. Louis Aquarium has just started, but they have a big nonprofit arm focused on education and conservation, particularly about river biodiversity. And there are a number of other entities in the area. And so we've very much tried to include them. And in fact, we have a title, Biodiversity Fellow, that people who want to be involved, if they're faculty members or if they're curators or the equivalent level. And we have something like 187 biodiversity fellows from 15 different institutions. So we are already, is really a regional organization, getting people to interact and collaborate. It would certainly be great to do more of that and to find ways to formally expand the partnership and so on. And I think that might happen. Very possibly, perhaps we would expand to the University of Missouri in Columbia or University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. I could certainly see that happening sometime down the line. But I will say this is a very rich area for people interested in biodiversity in many different ways. And I say this, I don't know, no one's told me it sounds stupid, but I think we could make this the Silicon Valley of biodiversity. We really have such a great set of resources here that all working together could make the region really known for our expertise in this area.
Awesome, great. So I have time for one more question. So what can the average, and this came up a bunch too, what can just the average person do to help maintain biodiversity? What can we do, just the normal person, to address this biodiversity crisis?
Well, I think there's 2 different things. One is in the terms of personal decisions and personal behavior, we can do things that minimize our impact on the environment. Anything from minimizing our energy use so as not to be contributing to global climate change, to not utilizing, to reducing the use of natural products. It'd be great if everyone were vegetarians. I'm not. I feel bad about that. I try to eat less meat. But all kinds of actions, minimize plastic use, Luz Rooney puts in chat, absolutely correct, just to behave in a responsible way as possible. And little actions, they do add up. At the same time, really, a lot of what needs to be done is at the level of governmental decisions, that the way our country and the rest of the world is run really affects in a major way the decisions that have huge impacts. And so influencing the political process, getting involved and being an activist for things you feel important and trying to trying to sway the changes that get made is critically important. You think about, and I don't want to be political here, but the policies of the Trump administration versus the Biden administration make huge differences to the world's biodiversity. And just both legislation and the way laws are implemented are very important. So make your voice heard if it matters to you.
Well, thank you so much. We have a few more questions that I've noticed both in the chat and the Q&A, and we can, I'm going to let most of the class go, but if there's a few of you who want to hang on, there's a couple questions that are kind of specific to lizards that I think they want, some people might want answers to. But I'm going to wrap up with some closing remarks right now. But if anyone wants to hang on for a little longer, we can extend the Q&A for about 15 or 20 minutes. Dr. Losos, we have really enjoyed spending the last hour with you learning more about the amazing work of the Living Earth Collaborative. For everyone viewing, we encourage you to visit the events page on the alumni website to learn about other ways to connect with WashU alumni, students, and faculty. And that link will be in the chat. And then that page will be updated regularly. For those signing off now, thank you for attending. This event is recorded and will be continued. The Q&A that extends will be continued to be recorded, and you can view it later. Everyone will receive the recording in a post-event email tomorrow. So any of you who are signing off now, thank you so much for joining us. This was a pleasure. And if you want to stick around and put some more questions in the chat, we can go from there. And I'll give you a minute to do that.
And to those of you saying thank you in the chat, you're very welcome. This has been a lot of fun.
So we had one about caudal anatomy. I don't know if Ted is still on the call, but do the fossil anoles from the Dominican Republic show evidence of caudal anatomy?
Well, caudal anatomy is the tail, and yes, some of them do. And in fact, one curious thing, we're really going to get into the weeds of lizard biology, the good stuff now, is as many of you may know, lizards can drop their tails. If you grab a lizard's tail, it will come off. Most lizards, not all. And the way they do that is that each vertebra, the tail is made up of a series of vertebrae. Each vertebra has a preformed zone of weakness that it's made to break apart. And at the same place, the blood vessels are made to crimp down right there, and the muscles are meant to separate. And so it easily loses its tail. However, when they regrow their tail, they do not regrow all those vertebrae. Instead, they just regrow a rod of cartilage, like your nose, the cartilage. And so they're not nearly as wiggly because it doesn't have all the little bones. It's just a rod of cartilage. You can see that in an X-ray or a CAT scan very clearly. And so you can see if they've regenerated their tails. And if I'm not mistaken, some of the amber ones, you can see they had regrown tails. So yes, anyway, a long way of saying you can see the caudal anatomy in some of the specimens very clearly.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you knew what that was. I sort of knew what that was, but I was like, well, I'm gonna ask it. And then another question from Lynn, are the anoles that you study considered an indicator species?
Well, it depends. There are 400 species of them, and an indicator species, I believe what you mean by that term, is that a species that can tell you about the health of the environment. And so if that species isn't doing well, it means that there is great to see you too, Ted, in the chat. It means that the environment has a problem. And the answer to that question is yes and no. One of the reasons that these lizards have been studied so much in the Caribbean is that they can be extremely common in human-modified habitats. And so if you go to, say, Jamaica or Puerto Rico, just walking around the towns or in agricultural fields, you will see lots of lizards because they do well in disturbed habitats. It makes them very easy to study because you can find lots of them, but it's not good for the health of, they don't indicate the health of the environment because they do fine in disturbed habitats. On the other hand, there are other species, particularly in Central America, that live in the rainforest that really need that rainforest, and so they could be an indicator species. So that is one of the great reasons, one of the reasons why this is such a great group to study, because with 400 species, there's lots of different ways to study them, or different situations.
Great. All right. I think we just have maybe, I have one more question, and then so we have two more unless another one comes up. My question is also just, I forgot to ask it earlier, just where can we go to learn more about this? Like, do you have any favorite podcasts or, websites or media that has resonated with you in the last year or so?
About which aspect in particular?
About diversity, about biodiversity, or maybe about evolution, or?
Oh, there's so much out there. It's almost too much. There's a new site, I don't know how new it is, it's called Manga Bay, that aggregates articles about conservation and biodiversity, and I found them to be a very good source. Scientific American publishes some very nice articles on various topics. It's at just the right level of description of science. It's not basic, but it's not so technical it gets hard to follow. Let me think. I'm kind of punting on this right now, trying to think of it. It just shows up. There's a site called Dodo that has heartwarming stories to a large extent about conservation success stories. The St. Louis Zoo and the Botanical Garden have good things on their websites as well. And of course, the WashU Record, you should definitely subscribe to. They do an excellent job writing up some of the things that the faculty here are doing in the Living Earth Collaborative. And they've published a lot of articles about the things that our people are doing. So those are the ones that immediately come to mind.
Yeah, sometimes I think, you can just type those things in and let Google do the rest, and then they'll just keep putting things in your feed, and all of a sudden you'll find some great things. All right, sorry, now we have the second to last question. Okay, John Hickey asked, he put this in the chat and I guess I missed it. He says that given that the three key institutions are Missouri-based, could the collaborative identify a signature campaign to illustrate how to improve biodiversity while impacting climate? Possible examples: 1, protect the Ozark forests that are currently being clear-cut to create cattle pastures. 2, research how intact riparian corridors help reduce the impact of major rain events caused by climate change. I think you mentioned that with the hurricanes in Louisiana. Or research how solar farms can actually be used as pollinator habitat. Is that real, or is it greenwashing?
Well, those are great ideas. And Missouri has a lot of biodiversity for a number of reasons. That because of the Ozarks, which are this fabulous, diverse area, it's a very biodiversity rich state. We actually have a history of being better at protecting our environment, at least in some ways, than other states. Our Department of Conservation is one of the best in the country. And so I'm not saying we don't have problems. We've got plenty of problems, but Missouri has a long history of being concerned about its environment. And so I think a Missouri-focused efforts, I think those are wonderful ideas. Certainly, there are projects going on that both the zoo and the Botanical Garden are already doing in this area, and that the Living Earth Collaborative has funded some projects, some local ones. But that gets me, it gets me thinking. I think that's a great idea. Here's a crazy idea that is being floated. It's not really, it's certainly not my idea, but the red wolf is a very endangered species of wolf that's almost extinct in the wild. It used to occur in Missouri. And what we have learned by reintroducing gray wolves to Yellowstone is that wolves have done remarkable things to make the environment healthier and change it. And we all talk about all the problems we have because we have too many deer here in Missouri because they don't have any predators. Maybe we should think about putting red wolves in a very controlled way, in a very scientifically studied way, in certain areas of the forest somewhere down in the Ozarks. Lots of work would need to be done. It would have to be done in a very safe way. But certainly, as I said, we're starting the CANID initiative, and anyway, that's an idea that has been at least floated, which would certainly take advantage of being in Missouri and a lot that Missouri biodiversity has to offer.
That's great. That outside of the box thinking is so important here as we try to solve some of the Earth's problems. just the last question we have is just the Macaulays are wondering what's on your shirt.
Why, of course, it's T-Rex.
Oh. Well, I think that's just about it for us. Thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Losos, for agreeing to spend this extra bit of time, and of course, for lending your expertise for the whole webinar. Really appreciated. So thank you very much, and everybody, all the WashU connectivity was so fun to be on this. So thank you very much for coming.
And thank you, Beanie, for joining us and doing such a great job at moderating.
Thank you.